We are here at Twin Cities Code Camp, and I'm talking with
Jason Bock.
And so Jason, you presented a topic yesterday,
Yep.
Saturday at Code Camp, on static analysis in .NET.
Yes,
correct?
you're correct.
So what is static analysis?
So static analysis is an engine, generally you can look at it as just a technique to look at your code, examine your code, see if it's following best practices, rules of thumb, principles from either using the general .NET framework or whatever framework you're using to make sure you're doing things correctly. So you want to discover these things sooner rather than later. I mentioned in the talk that a principle I try to uphold when I'm doing software development is fail fast, because it's much better, much less expensive, and much less embarrassing if you fail right at compile time or right in your machine when you're running your unit tests, rather than waiting until it gets out in production and you have tens, if not hundreds, thousands, millions of people finding the bug that you wrote and got it all the way there. That's a bad thing. So static analysis in .NET sits after the compilation step. So if you think of that type of pipeline, you've got compilation, then that's really all that happens in .NET, but then this happens afterwards.
Right.
So if you use Premium or Visual Studio Ultimate, you can add that in, and then it runs all the rules.
Right. So what would be are there scenarios when static analysis is more useful than others, or are there certain scenarios like if I'm developing just as a single person, should I care, or is it only for teams of developers?
I would do it all the time. So there's projects that I have out there in open source where it's just me developing and I have it on. I've been on projects with 5, 10, how many other developers we have it on as well. In fact, I think for the last 3 or 4 years, it's just if I have a version of Visual Studio that's there, I'll turn it on. If we don't have it, we'll go download FXCOP and make sure it runs at least on the build server all the time. Getting that immediate feedback is always worth it in the long run from what I've been able to get from my own experience. Even if when you get that little bit of a perf hit, because that has to run after the compiler and it does take a little bit of time to do that analysis, that always pays off to catch those mistakes or those things that maybe I'm not doing right rather than seeing them later on. Right. So I would say do it all the time.
So what's the source of these rules? Like who's to say what rules should be there, and what if I don't think the rules are enough, or what if I think a rule doesn't make sense for me? What in both those scenarios, what do you do?
So the first part is where the rules come from. They're defined by Microsoft. So there's a set of rules. I think it's like 200 or 300 or something like that. And there's a book called, I think, .NET Framework Design Guidelines. I don't think that's the exact title, but it's a book that a couple people wrote at Microsoft that ended up laying the foundation for these rules that are run with code analysis. And so they're rules that are considered pretty good. They're the ones that also .NET and Microsoft follow when they're adding on new APIs. So naming conventions, performance factors, things like that. So it's generally considered a good rule set. You can define your own, and that's something else I talk about in the presentation. How can you create your own custom rules for like third-party libraries? WCF has some conventions, CSLA has some conventions, and again, you can check those right after compilation. If you don't want to have some of the rules executed during the static analysis portion, you can go in to Visual Studio and you can uncheck certain rules. So for example, if you don't care about internationalization or globalization, you can just basically click off all those rules in one shot. You're not potentially catching some of the things that if you ever needed to have somebody say, your app is awesome and now we want it for everybody rather than just English speakers. Well, now if you turn those on, you might suddenly realize there's some things that we're doing that if we had those on, we'd already have caught it and coded for it.
Right.
But if you're on a project where you already had a significant portion of time done developing that code, you may not want to turn them all on at once because you might get overwhelmed.
Right.
And then you can just target certain like performance rules or things like that. Design rules are good, and those will probably give you the best bang for the buck. And then as time goes on, slowly add on more of the rules.
Right. Yeah, I remember the first time I tried FXCOP back in the day, doing that exact same thing, and you'd have 500 warnings show up in your code base. And but with the new code base, it's a lot easier to do it right from the start.
And you actually mentioned something when you get 500 warnings. I also recommend to people that they turn all the rules on that they want to have executed as errors, because if you ever have compiler warnings as errors on, Or if you have the static analysis errors on, when they come up in Visual Studio, they're actually errors and they're red. They're red lights, you can't go on. If they're just warnings, you see them down at the bottom, you floor it. That's what you do at a yellow light, right?
Right.
And so you're not gonna get the benefit of seeing, oh wait, I have a field that's unused, or I'm not disposing my object correctly. Those are things you probably wanna actually address. So turn them on as errors, get that immediate feedback right away, fix them, and then move on.
Right. All right. So kind of on a different topic. So you've organized every Twin Cities Code Camp that has existed.
Yep.
You put
For
the whole-
Twin Cities, yeah.
For Twin Cities, right. So you put the event together from the start. This is our 11th event. So what do you think of the event now that we've come this far, that we're in the 11th one and where it's gone?
Well, at this point, we just talked about this before, is we have it down to almost a science. It's, there's still things that come up and still things we're learning, like, oh yeah, some of the guys' bathrooms have run out of toilet paper.
Right, yeah.
Maybe we should just keep some, buy a roll or two and just have them just in case, But in general, I mean, that's a facility thing, we don't have control over that. But in general, we kind of know the schedule, we know the meetings we're gonna have beforehand as part of the leadership team, as you are part of as well. Going through having a couple meetings beforehand, figuring out the sponsors, talks, maybe do things a little differently. We know that we're gonna get here on Saturday and we got it all coordinated with the U of M and who to talk to, and what rooms we want. So from that perspective, it's consistent, but I also wanna see, is there any way we can keep making this better? Maybe one idea is have maybe part of the day have shorter sessions. So some are 75, maybe you start bringing them down to 60 so that you don't have to have a session that's quite that long. We talked last time with some of the speakers and ideas to have like a forum. So you have 3 or 4 speakers sitting up and you have a moderator who has some questions canned in case you don't get some from the audience, but it's really geared towards audience participation. They can go ask these people and say, hey, what do you think about this? And then you got a panel of 3 or 4 people who are fairly skilled in a certain area and can address that. So we're always looking at doing different things like that. I don't want to just get into a rut and have it always the same. If you can bring some variety and figure out ways to make it better and maybe try something and it doesn't work, that's great, but keep trying to look at doing different things.
Right. Great. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
TwinCitiesCodeCamp.